Well, hello, everyone. I'm Janet B. from North Carolina. I've recovered from compulsive eating. Happy to be here tonight to talk about God's search and rescue mission for Dr. Bob. So, as we know, we're all allowed to have our own conception of God. Here's a thumbnail sketch of mine. God created the world in 6 days. He took a day off to rest. And instead of spending the rest of eternity watching Netflix, which I might be prone to do, he decided he would spend a good deal of his time launching search and rescue missions for addicts. So here's the story of one of God's most successful search and rescue stories, the story of Dr. Bob, one of the two co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, which Overeaters Anonymous sprang out of, the other founder being Bill Wilson, and he will appear in our story as well. So Dr. Bob comes right after the chapter A Vision for You in the Big Book. So if you have your big book, we are on page 171. And before we talk about how God rescued Dr. Bob, let's get a little background on our hero. So he starts out by saying, I was born in a small New England village of about 7,000 souls. And he goes on to say everything was fine. His parents were fine. The town was fine. They were moral, good. He had a great childhood. So his parents were great, but he became an addict anyway. And I think that's important because I think a lot of us say, well, the reason I'm a compulsive eater is because dot, dot, dot. And then we usually blame someone. And if we're honest, the main people we blame are our parents. But remember, in the story Freedom from Bondage, page 544, the author says she didn't become an alcoholic because of what happened to her in her childhood. She said, I am the result of the way I reacted to what happened to me as a child. So again, it's always our responsibility. Are we going to forgive or are we going to blame? Because ultimately, the fact that I'm a compulsive eater has nothing to do with how I was raised. It has to do with the way I live my life. And Dr. Bob makes that clear, right? Continue on page 172. He says, I was the only child which perhaps engendered the selfishness which played an important part in bringing on my alcoholism. Now, of course, if we only have one child or if we're an only child, we shouldn't get all scared and say, oh my gosh, I am doomed to be an addict the rest of my life. No, Dr. Bob isn't saying it was the only child part. He's saying it was the selfishness part. And later on the page, he really digs in and defines it. This is what he says. He says, my whole life seemed to be centered around doing what I wanted to do without regard for the rights, wishes, or privileges of anyone else, a state of mind which became more and more predominant as the years passed. More and more predominant. Well, that's interesting. We always talk about this illness as being progressive, but we usually talk about it in terms of food, right? Our binges are getting worse. They're getting closer together. But he's talking about even before the binging, his selfishness and self-centeredness got worse. Well, that makes sense, right? Page 62 of our text says, selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. So Dr. Bob was right on the money by saying that selfishness and self-centeredness are the roots. And I actually drew a little picture of a tree in my big book, and I drew roots under the tree. And I wrote the words selfish and self-centered by the roots. The thing about roots, though, is that you don't see them. So we can be really good at hiding our selfishness and self-centeredness. But on a tree, what do we see? We see the fruit. So I drew these three little circles like apples. And in one, I wrote an R for resentment, an F for fear, and H for harms, because those are the three fruits of this illness: resentments, fears, and harms to the people in our lives. So there's Dr. Bob saying he was selfish and self-centered, and you can even see it by the example he gave. He said, my parents made me go to church, and basically I'll show them. He says, I decided when I was old enough I would never go to church. Interesting, he turns his back on God, but he makes an exception, except when circumstances made it unwise to absent myself. So basically, he was using church, saying, oh, I'll go to church if someone will be mad at me for not going, or if it'll look good for me and help me get a good job if I go. He used God, he used church in a self-centered, self-serving way. So it made me think something that we should ask ourselves, and I should ask myself, do we use religion? Do we use God? Do we ignore God except when we want to treat him like a genie in the bottle? Like, God, things aren't working too well here. Please come out of your bottle, make everything good again. And if you do, thanks. I'll call you next time I need you. And if you don't, well, that gives me one more reason to ignore you. The genie in the bottle God concept didn't work for me, and it didn't work for Dr. Bob. So Dr. Bob continues talking about the progression of his selfishness. He says through college, through medical school, he was drinking. And when I was prepping this chapter, I noticed something on page 174. It says his father, when Bob was in college, made a long journey to see him in the vain endeavor to get him straightened out, but it had little effect. So Dr. Bob had a father who loved him and who may have died before Dr. Bob even got sober. But he loved him, and Dr. Bob felt it. Twice in his story, he mentioned his father's attempt to help him. And so it made me think of the times we might do something for people out of love and never see the results. And that's okay. You know, imagine if Dr. Bob's dad said, I'm not going to try to help my son again. I've already gone out there once. I'm not seeing any results. None of us would be here. But he still tried. And what that teaches me is that I still need to love and put love into action, which means self-sacrifice for the good of other people, even when it's difficult and even if I don't see fruit. So Bob becomes Dr. Bob on the bottom of page 174, every mother's dream, right? But he says, by this time, I was beginning to pay very dearly physically, and in hope of relief, I voluntarily incarcerated myself at least a dozen times in one of the local sanitariums. Okay, here's a guy who wants to get better. He locks himself up. He's a doctor, so the people know him. But he says, I need to be locked up because I just can't stop. So he had a desire to stop. But y'all, what we know, right? Desire alone doesn't do it. Page 24 of our big book says, at a certain point in the drinking of every abnormal drinker, in the eating of every abnormal drinker, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop is of absolutely no avail. Dr. Bob had a desperate desire to stop drinking. I mean, I had a desperate desire to stop binging, but he didn't have the power. When the obsession struck, he did what any good addict would do. He got his friends to smuggle alcohol into the rehab, or he'd steal the alcohol in the hospital. And it got worse. He said he's in rehab, actually getting worse. And guys, that was me my first 7 years in OA. I went to meetings. I ran through, no joke, about 50 different sponsors. I did the work they told me, but I got progressively worse because they weren't telling me the right work. I went from binging and purging twice a week to throwing up to 6 times a day and needing major surgery on my esophagus. Like Dr. Bob, I had the desire, did a bunch of work, but I was like someone with diabetes who went to Diabetes Anonymous meetings without ever being taught how to inject insulin. I got worse, and so did Dr. Bob. Right? If we want it, even if we're in a rehab, we're going to get it. I was once at an OA meeting and heard a woman say that she locked herself up in rehab, then sent herself a candygram. You know, unless we're safe and protected by God, it doesn't matter where we are. We have no choice when it comes to food if we are not safe and protected by God, which these 12 steps show us and guide us on how to be there. So there's Dr. Bob not getting better. And again, his dad's trying to help him. Not only did his dad calm down, now his dad sent the family doctor to try. Still nothing. Then prohibition starts. Prohibition is when alcohol was 100% illegal in the entire United States. So Dr. Bob says, well, I'll get drunk now because in a month prohibition starts and I'll just wait and I'll start then. But of course, there were bootleggers, people who sold illegal alcohol, and he was able to get it anyway. But it made me think of what I'd been guilty of when I would binge and say, I'll start tomorrow. The I'll start tomorrow syndrome. I think we've all had it, right? So here's Dr. Bob. I'll start when prohibition comes. Or me, I'll start Monday, the first of the month, January 1st. I'll start tomorrow. But when I had that I'll start tomorrow syndrome, that was really evidence that I didn't have a first step, that I thought I had power, that I had this magic pillow. And if I put my head on it for 7 hours, suddenly I was going to wake up a new person, a miracle pillow. That's no first step. When we take a first step, we realize miracle pillows don't exist. So there's Dr. Bob. He's drinking. He's working in a hospital now. He drinks and then he goes home and he passes out and he goes to work just so he can earn enough money to drink, not to help people, not to provide for his family, but so he could drink. And he kept this up for 17 years. Can you imagine that? He said 17 years. He says, during that time, I used to promise my wife, my friends, my children that I would drink no more. Promises which seldom kept me sober, even through the day, though I was very sincere when I made them. That was me. Very sincere every morning. I'm not going to binge today. Couldn't make it to work without stopping at the bakery. So there's Dr. Bob. He's sincere. He has a desire, but desire doesn't do it, right? Imagine someone who has cancer going to their wife, their friends, their children, saying, I promise I will make my cancer cells stop multiplying. It would be heartbreaking, right? Because we know that person has zero power. But what we do have the power to do is to go to that doctor, and a doctor who we know can cure whatever illness we have, get the prescription, get the treatment protocol, and follow it 100%. That's how people recover from physical illnesses. And that's how we recover. So page 178, there's Dr. Bob's 17 years of binging, of drinking. And he talks about a group of people he found, and he says, they attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. So this was the Oxford group, a Christian spiritual group that helped people with different problems. So he was attracted by their poise. What's poise? A self-confidence, not based on pride. It's based on confidence that God's got my back, that God's taking care of me so I can be comfortable in any situation. And that's what these people had. He said they had great freedom from embarrassment. They were at ease on all occasions, and they appeared healthy and happy. That's a trait we should look for in recovery. And that if we're in recovery, we want to exude it, not to be phony, but we don't want people to look at us and say, oh my gosh, I know she's in recovery, but she looks so sad. Like all this work she's doing to help others and stay abstinent, she doesn't even have time to like wash her hair. No, no, we're supposed to exude happiness, joy, and freedom. I mean, that's a promise. That's a fruit in this of this program. So it should be evident. So Dr. Bob, he's no dummy. He looks at himself. He says he sees he's ill at ease. His health was at the breaking point, and he is thoroughly miserable. And he says, I sensed they had something I didn't have, from which I might profit. And I learned it was something of a spiritual nature, which didn't appeal to me very much. So he was honest. It's like, okay, I see they're happy, healthy, poised, and it's the result of spiritual work. So he said, I'll give it some study. So he studied. So he was basically on the fence for 2.5 years. 2.5 years, he's studying, but he still got drunk every night. And isn't that like a lot of us? I remember reading program literature while I was binging. And that was Dr. Bob, reading and getting nowhere. Um, Dr. Bob says that his wife's faith kept him alive during that time. Well, that's beautiful, right? But it's also interesting. How could someone else's faith keep someone else alive during a time? What's the nexus? What's the correlation there? Because faith actually does something in the spiritual world. Faith is the currency of the spiritual world. It leads us to communicate with God, right? I can't hand God my American Express card, but I can hand him my prayers. And maybe it was Dr. Bob's wife's faith. Maybe it was her whispered prayers that led God to say, my next search and rescue mission will be for her husband. Or maybe it was because at that point, Dr. Bob finally said at one of the Oxford group meetings held at the house of Henrietta Seiberling, remember that name, it'll come up again. She was on God's search and rescue team. At Henrietta's house, Dr. Bob said, guys, I have this confession to make. I'm an alcoholic. And, I can just picture them like all laughing behind their hands, like, yeah, Bob, tell us something we don't all know it already. Um, they all knew he was an alcoholic. And Henrietta said, we'll pray for you. And so there they were praying for him. So you got their faith and their prayers, and the faith and prayers of Dr. Bob's wife all going up to God. And what was the result? Well, we talked about it a little last week. We'll flip back in the chapter of Vision for You, page 155. Our other co-founder, Bill Wilson, didn't live anywhere near Dr. Bob, but just happened to be there on a business trip, right? If God's on a search and rescue mission, he can put people on certain business trips. And Bill, we know, newly sober, business deal gone down the tubes. His health was bad. He had no money. He was physically weak. I mean, he was kind of a train wreck. And he said, I'd better do something so I don't drink. And he went to a payphone, a list of half a dozen churches. And he said, I need to find some like priest, minister, pastor somewhere who's going to give me a drunk to help, or I will drink. That's how seriously he took it. And finally, we know the story. He called a pastor who said, I'll get you in touch with this woman who has this spiritual group at her house. Maybe she can help. Bill Wilson calls Henrietta. When she answers the phone, he says, my name is Bill. I'm in town for business. I'm newly sober. Do you know a drunk I can help? And I always want to cry when I read that. She simply said, we've been expecting you. We've been expecting you. She knew that her prayers were going to work. So it wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't believe God answered my prayer. It's like, yeah, we prayed for help. Well, of course. We didn't know how it would come, but we knew it would come. Because God isn't limited to how we think things will work out. She might have thought, she probably did think he would get sober in the Oxford group. God had other plans. So Henrietta said, we've been expecting you. She invited Bill over and she called Dr. Bob's wife and said, she probably said, Annie, our prayers have been heard. Can you bring him over here tomorrow to talk to this guy, Bill? And Dr. Bob said, fine, but I'm not going more than 15 minutes. I actually did a little research in the book AA Comes of Age about that first meeting. Bill really prepared for that meeting. He talked to Dr. Silkworth, the author of The Doctor's Opinion, before he left Akron, because he said he was trying to help people and they weren't getting better. So they were talking strategy. How can they help others? And basically, Dr. Silkworth said the first thing you have to do is help someone see they're powerless by forming an identification. And maybe that's why like going to a therapist never worked for me, right? A therapist could tell me what I was doing, but she didn't have that experience. Um, so Dr. Silkworth basically told him, you have to get the guy to take a first step, to admit he's powerless, that his life is a train wreck. Ego deflation at great depths is what they called it back then. So Bill went there and instead of getting all spiritual and telling him like how great all these religious or spiritual principles were, he shared stories about how he used to drink, about how he would say, I'm just going to have one, but would end up drinking until he lost everything. So he's telling Bob, and I'm sure Dr. Bob's saying, yeah, I drink like that too. Like this is the first guy who drinks like I do that I've heard of. So he was only going to stay 15 minutes. He stayed over 6 hours. And that's another thing about what Bill, he was willing to put in the time. So we need to ask ourselves that, are we willing to put in the time to help someone who's still suffering? So Dr. Bob was willing, but not willing enough. On page 155, he says, a spiritual experience, he conceded, was absolutely necessary, but the price seemed high upon the basis suggested. Why, he argued, should he foolishly admit his problem to his clients? He would do anything, he said, but that. And as we'll see, his but that and our but that's, right, is what always gets us in trouble. So Bill stayed with Dr. Bob for 3 weeks. He kept working with him. Bob stopped drinking, and then he went to a medical conference. And I find it really fascinating what happens next. Dr. Bob gets drunk at this conference, drunk on the way home, wakes up drunk at a friend's house, not knowing how he got there. And the friend called his wife, who called Bill. And what did Bill do? He didn't say, I spent 3 weeks out of my life helping you, working with you. How dare you do this to me? Or I told you that you shouldn't go away with so little time under your belt. I'm on the next train back to New York. Goodbye and good luck. He didn't do that. Here's what Dr. Bob says Bill did. He came and got me home and to bed. He took him home and put him to bed. Okay, think about that. Putting a drunk alcoholic to bed. Bob probably smelled. Like Bill probably took his shoes off his dirty feet and covered him with a blanket. And Bill stayed with him. And there's an interesting line on page 180. It says, he stayed with him, and the next day he gave him 1 glass of beer. And I was thinking, why on earth did he give him 1 glass of beer? I mean, I never had a sponsor give me like 1 cookie on my first day, but here's why. The reason is Dr. Bob was scheduled to do a surgery that only he could do a couple days after he got back from that trip gone bad. And he was shaking so badly that Bill gave him 1 glass of beer to steady his hand so that he could perform the surgery. So we should not take this as an example that if someone goes out binging, we're supposed to give them 1 Milky Way bar the next day. No. This was for a very specific person, a very specific reason. So his hand wouldn't shake. He did the surgery, which was successful. And Bob never drank after that because here's what he did. Right after the surgery, he went around the town and he told all the people he didn't want to tell, I'm an alcoholic. He did that, so his I'll do anything but that became I'll do anything, period. And we know that's critical, right? Page 58 tells us who's going to recover, who can work the steps. If you've decided you want what we have, and what do we have? A spiritual spirit as the result of these steps, and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then, and I say then and only then, are you ready to take certain steps? So Bob became willing and he never drank again. And he spends the last couple of pages in his story talking about his recovery and giving us lots of pearls of wisdom. He says, okay, you may be asking, what did that man, Bill, do or say that was different from what others had said or done? Because, we can assume Dr. Bob read the Bible. He read lots of spiritual literature. He's been around spiritual people. He's read a lot of scientific literature. He's a doctor. It says, first, Bill gave him correct information. And I would say Bill also gave him love. Dr. Bob wasn't a project to Bill. He loved him. There's love if you're going to take a drunk man home, take his shoes off, put him to bed, and then keep working with him to figure out what went wrong. Love and good information. So when we're working with people, we want to make sure that we impart that. If we have just love and bad information, well, that's like all the lovely people I knew my first 7 years of OA. They were very lovely, very kind, but not one of them ever sat down and said to me, if you're not honest, don't even bother because it won't work. They didn't sit there and say, you have to get a relationship with God, and here's exactly how to do it. But if someone gave me information and didn't have love, that would make it really difficult. I think a person has to feel cared for. Now, that doesn't mean like when I'm sponsoring, I don't set boundaries, like this is what you need to do if we're going to work together. But if they don't do it, I don't scream at them, right? Because people aren't criminals. We're just people who are sick. And if I'm not sick anymore, it's only because maybe I got on the bus one stop ahead of the next guy. Doesn't make me any better, just means the bus came to my street first. So love and good information. And Dr. Bob says, of far more importance was the fact he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. And that goes along with what it says to the foreword to the third edition, that recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. I used to not believe that. I used to believe that recovery began when someone takes a certain step. But I've rethought that. When one addict talks to another, something happens. There's more than a conveying of information, there is a transmission. Bill Wilson was transmitting something to Dr. Bob. I looked up the definition of transmission. It says that something like heat, light, sound, electricity, or other energy passes through a medium, kind of like telephones transmitting sound waves. And I think that in God's search and rescue mission for Dr. Bob, God used Bill Wilson to transmit God's own love and concern to Bob. And if we go to page 164, the end of that chapter, A Vision for You, that beautiful page, it talks about this kind of transmission, right? It says, you cannot transmit something you haven't got. So see to it that your relationship with Him, with God, is right, and great things will come to pass for you and countless others. See to it that your relationship with God is right. That's the condition. Well, what does that mean? Remember, Bill Wilson first got sober, and when he was in the hospital, he said, the thought came to me that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They, in turn, could help others. But before Bill could be fit to do this work, he had to see to it that his relationship with God was right. How did he do it? How do we all do it? Page 164 tells us, abandon yourself to God as you understand Him. That means basically we give God a blank check with our lives. Do what you want with my health. Do what you want with my career. Do what you want, the hardest one often, with my children. We give God a blank check and says, admit your faults to Him. Okay, that's hard. And to your fellows. Well, that's harder, right? Because we, or at least I, have pride. It says, clear away the wreckage of your past, give freely of what you find. And when we do that, we can join them. We can join our founders. And Bill did that. He made those 6 calls. He didn't just make 2 and say, I give up. Then he went to this strange woman's house. And even before he gets there, he spends time brainstorming with someone on the best way to help this guy who he's never met. And then he spends over 6 hours with him that day, stays in that town, probably misses his wife, doesn't go back to his wife, stays for 3 weeks to help this guy. And when he finally thinks, I've helped someone, Dr. Bob breaks his heart by coming home drunk. And sometimes it does break our heart. That's okay. I think I've broken God's heart many, many, many times. So if mine gets broken by, getting hurt by people I try to work with, it's okay. Bill kept at it. And thank God, because if he hadn't, who knows if any of us would be here. So page 180, Dr. Bob says, it's the most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse with which I was afflicted. He says he's regained his health, his self-respect, and his home life is ideal. Then he says he spends a great deal of time passing this on to others who want and need it badly. And he says he does it for 4 reasons. 1, a sense of duty. 2, it's a pleasure. 3, in doing so, he's paying his debt to the person who carried the message to him. And 4, an insurance policy against drinking again. First, it's a duty, because the truth is, I'll admit sometimes I'm a slacker. I don't want to pick up that phone. I don't want to take the time. Um, I can be selfish. So some days, yeah, I do it just out of duty. But often, and this is more often as time goes by, it's for the second reason. It is a pleasure, right? The more we grow spiritually, the more what happens sometimes is what we have to do and what we want to do become the same. And then his third reason, because in doing so, I'm paying my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me. That's gratitude in action. And I have to tell you, when I hear my sponsees sponsoring someone or telling their story at a meeting about how God has removed their food obsession, there aren't many things that bring more joy than that. And last, he says, every time I do it, I take out a little more insurance for myself against a possible slip. It is our best insurance policy. Chapter 7, first line says, nothing will so much ensure immunity against alcoholism or compulsive eating as intensive work with other alcoholics or compulsive eaters. Intensive work, not a 5-minute phone call, intensive work. Dr. Bob continues by saying he used to get upset when he saw his friends drink, but realized he couldn't. So he schooled himself to believe that though he once had the same privilege, he abused it so frightfully it was withdrawn. So we can do that. We can say to ourselves, self, I used to have that privilege to be able to eat or do whatever, but I abused that privilege frightfully, and now it's withdrawn. Just like if we get too many tickets or too many car accidents, our privilege to have a driver's license is revoked. And then Dr. Bob starts in with some tough love. He says, if you think you're an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what's in this book, I feel sorry for you. That's pretty interesting. He calls atheism, agnosticism, and skepticism pride, intellectual pride. Because if I'm an atheist or an agnostic or a skeptic, it's really me thinking I can do it on my own. And I love how he doesn't say, if you're an atheist, agnostic, or skeptic. He says, if you think you are, meaning you may think you are, but you're not. Well, how could he say that, right? Is that like a bit arrogant on Dr. Bob's part? Well, I don't think so. I mean, what if I was like a lung atheist, right? Like I live in America. I could say, I have no lungs. There are no lungs in my body. It's my right to think that. Well, I could think that all I want, but I still have lungs. And our book tells us that basically what I think about my lack of lungs doesn't matter. Page 55 says, deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. So between those two lungs that I may or may not believe I have, God planted the fundamental idea of himself. And the big book says this fundamental idea of God can be obscured by calamity, pomp, and worship of other things. And I could talk for hours about that, but we'll do that another time. For now, suffice it to say, Dr. Bob is basically saying, you may think you don't believe in God, but you do. It's down there. And it's like an invitation, right? I don't want to look at it as like Dr. Bob's being really pompous. It's an invitation that we don't have so much pride that we block ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. So Dr. Bob continues on with his tough love. If you think you're strong enough to do it your way, that's your affair. Like, we're not going to try and convince you you really need this. But if you really want to quit for good and all, not just to look good at your high school reunion so the boy who dumped you when you were 17 feels bad. If you want to quit for good and all and feel you need help, he says, we know we have an answer for you. And then he has a conditional promise. It never fails. Okay, it never fails, but here's the condition. It never fails if you go about it with one half the zeal you've been in the habit of showing when you're getting another drink. I put a lot of zeal into getting my binge foods. I stole food. I stole money for food. I walked the streets of New York City at 2 a.m. with my rent money. Today, even decades later, I still have to put that kind of effort into my recovery. If we do this work, we are promised that it will never fail. And on the last line, he tells us why it will never fail. It says, our Heavenly Father will never let us down. God will never let us down. So I believe we're all here because God has launched a search and rescue mission for every single one of us. And he's given us a manual, a big book, and people to help us so that we can recover and then join him on his search and rescue missions for others. The way that Bill joined and rescued Bob, and then they rescued AA number 3, and down through the years to us. Like, what a glorious sense of purpose for all of us, and what a glorious God to give it to us. And I personally am very grateful. And with that, I will pass.